Hello, welcome Facebook Live. This is how do I know if my baby is really ready to eat? So some of you guys might be wondering, okay, what's the deal with waiting and what's the deal with when my baby needs to eat? So I've got the answers for you. Okay, my name is JamesFerraro. I'm a registered dietitian and I'm a mom of 5 small kids. I teach nutrition at colleges. I teach nutrition at the University of San Diego and the University of California at San Francisco. And I work with tons of different families and students all about how to teach families how to start solid foods and how do we feed our infants and our kids, etc. So the reason why we're having this conversation today is lately I've been getting tons of questions from my different communities all about, okay, what is the deal with waiting to feed food? So there's actually a pretty interesting study published in the journal Pediatrics this week that showed that pediatricians are actually starting to back off of really early food recommendations. And so the area of confusion starts when parents sometimes hear, okay, you can start feeding your baby somewhere between 4 and 6 months. Now, to those of you who are like in your 30s, 4 or 6 months, 2-month difference, what's the big deal? Okay, well, there's a huge difference between trying to feed a baby who's 2 months old or 4 months old versus trying to feed a baby who's 6 months old, right? Like if you're 4 months old, an extra 2 months is like 50% of your lifespan. So especially, there's so many developmental changes happening so rapidly during the 4 to 6 month mark. It's like, is my baby ready to eat at 4 months or should they be waiting towards 6 and what's the deal? So guidelines definitely fluctuate and I don't want you to feel like you're living in this isolated arena and you're the only one who's like, I don't know if my baby's actually ready to eat. I recently did a focus group actually with first-time parents with babies less than 1 who the parents were all in their early 30s, and I was so surprised that 85% of them had been told by their pediatrician to start white rice cereal at about 4 months. And at about 4 months was the area that confused a lot of parents. Like a lot of them asked, that seems kind of early. So what do you think? So part of the reason why I started looking more into this is because I have been reading this book, which I'm really excited. This book is called Inventing Baby Food, and the author is Amy Bentley. And she's actually going to be on a Facebook Live with us in a couple of weeks, so I will let you know all about that. We're going to be talking all about baby food and the whole baby food industry. Fascinating stuff. But one of the coolest things I thought about Dr. Bentley's book, and she teaches at New York University in the Food Studies Department, and at the very beginning of the book, there's this really cool graph. And so I'm going to actually link to the actual graph for you because she told me I could reuse the graph in the book. But first of all, the coolest thing is there's a graph that shows the average age of introduction of solid foods, like over decades. The coolest thing is that her kid made this graph and then she used it in the book. I cannot wait until my kids are old enough to help me work. So the cool thing about the graph is, okay, if you look at, I'm gonna just read you the basics, the 1880s, the average age of introducing food to a baby was about 11 months. Now, if you go to 1950, it dropped down to 1 month. Okay, in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't uncommon to have your pediatrician tell you that it was fine to start solid food within the first weeks of life. Okay, then in the 80s, it started creeping back up, closer to about 4 months. And then now we've kind of settled on this agreement that at least the American Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization agree that we should start solid foods at around 6 months of age. Now, there's still a lot of doctors out there who are saying start at 4 months. And so what we're going to talk about today is why a 4-month-old baby is not yet ready to eat. And part of the reason why I think it's important to have this discussion is because a lot of parents get really stressed out about the introduction of solid foods. I'm a dietitian and I work with tons of other dietitians and I get emails from them like, I don't think my baby's ready to eat yet. So I want to let parents know that it's okay to wait and it's actually recommended to wait. So as I mentioned, American Academy of Pediatrics, they say there's no need to introduce solid foods prior to 6 months. You can try if you want to, but the reality is, and the World Health Organization says the same thing, a little bit more stringent, a little bit closer to the 6 month mark. We agree that not all babies are ready to start food at the same time, okay? But I'll tell you, no matter how smart your baby is and how well developed they are, or how fussy they are, or how hungry you think they are, a baby at 4 months of age does not need any additional nutrition outside of breast milk or infant formula. Now, in some rare cases, if they have feeding difficulties, they may need supplemental nutrition. But if that's the case, you're likely being pretty closely followed by a feeding specialist. But for the general, not ill baby population, don't stress out, moms and dads. Breast milk or formula is perfectly fine until the baby is about 6 months of age. Okay, so there's no need, like at the 4-month mark, to start feeling that you need to be introducing solid foods. And so in today's little chat here, we're not going to be talking so much about what to feed, but really more about when to feed, right? Because you got to don't want to put the cart before the horse. Don't worry about what to feed if it's not even time to feed yet. So, okay, why is it not a good idea to start feeding your baby at 4 months of age? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, there's absolutely no need to, right? Your baby doesn't need any additional nutrition, okay? Secondly, they're not physically ready yet. So from a physiology standpoint, they have the anatomy, right? They were born with a mouth, and by the way, your baby can certainly start eating even before he or she has teeth. But how do they actually use that anatomy? They're not ready to use it at 4 months of age. Okay, so let's start talking about your baby's ability to sit up. Okay, we're gonna go through some of the readiness signs to eat, and I have a download for you guys. If you hang out till the end, I'll let you know the URL so you can download this readiness to feed checklist and hopefully share it with other friends and colleagues who might be stressing out about whether or not their baby needs to start solid foods. We're also gonna talk about why you don't wanna wait too long though, because you don't get off the hook forever. So, okay, can your baby sit up relatively unassisted? Okay, the muscles that are involved with having relatively decent core strength and the ability to sit relatively unassisted, those muscular movements play a role in learning how to eat as well. So if you got a super floppy baby who's not even close to sitting up yet, okay, even if you prop her up in the high chair, she's not ready to eat. Okay, so babies tend to be closer to sitting up more at like the 5 and the 6 month mark, especially sitting up relatively by their own. So what about from the oral motor skill standpoint? Can a baby who's 4 months old eat? I mean, certainly you could shove food in their mouth, as many parents do. And I myself, when my older daughter was 4 months old, my pediatrician said start feeding her rice cereal, so I did. Okay, she absolutely hated it. She spit everything out. She wouldn't let me spoon feed her, probably because I was starting way before she was actually ready. But when a baby's very young, the majority of their tongue will stimulate the gag reflex if that tongue is stimulated. Now, as the baby gets a little bit older and closer to the appropriate age to start solid foods, you'll notice that that reflex kind of recedes closer to the back third or the back quarter of the tongue, meaning that this protective mechanism, right, spit and reject everything out of my mouth that's not supposed to be there, like solid food when you're 4 months old, that starts to recede, okay? And then the baby has a little bit more self-control, and they can start manipulating and handling the foods on the front part of their tongue, and then chewing it even without teeth, and starting to move it to the back, and then handle and learn how to swallow. So as far as readiness to feed goes, we see that recession of that tongue thrust reflex, and the gagging reflex actually moving to the back part of the tongue, closer and beyond the 6 month mark. Usually by 9 months, most babies have really mastered that. So, okay, what about some signs about readiness to feed? Okay, I mentioned there's a couple of things that you guys want to look for, and these can be really confusing to parents too. Like they'll look up stuff on the internet and be like, this could mean anything. So around the 6 month mark is generally what we recommend, okay? You can start a little bit early if you want. You can start a little bit later than that if you need to. I have quadruplet babies, and they were born premature. So they were 6 weeks premature. So most feeding experts would recommend starting at their age-adjusted mark for 6 months. So my babies on their 6 month birthday, they weren't even remotely interested in food. But by 6 weeks later, when they were 7.5 months or 6 months adjusted age, that's when I felt comfortable starting solid food. But I'll have you know, with 4 different babies learning how to eat all at once, they didn't all just get magically ready to eat at the 6 month mark. And I work with parents a lot who are like, I fed my baby 3 times already and they hate eating and they rejected it. I'm 3 days in and this is an utter failure. You guys, it's not an utter failure. In some of the future Facebook Lives, we're gonna talk about the importance of introducing different foods and how many times you have to do it, and you are not an utter failure, okay? But it seems counterintuitive, like, oh, they don't like it, I'm gonna stop feeding. That's not the case, so. But back to when they're ready to feed, one of my sons, Henry, he just sat there and wasn't interested in eating at all. Like for a couple of weeks, he would just put his head down on the table when the other kids were eating. Now, I would have felt terrible if he were my only baby and sitting there and totally rejecting all the food I ate. But the point was he just needed a couple weeks to get ready. I still offered it to him, but don't stress out because not all babies are going to be ready at exactly 6 months. But that's a good time to go ahead and think about introducing solid foods. Now, I mentioned the ability to sit up relatively unassisted. That's another good one that you want to look out for. And then also, we talk about the disappearance of this tongue thrust reflex. It's also called the extrusion reflex. It's kind of a fancy name just to indicate that the baby, that protective mechanism where they push everything out of their mouth, okay, at the earlier stages of infancy, as that starts to recede, okay, that's an indicator that they're getting ready to eat, okay? And so you kind of stack that on top of, are they able to sit relatively unassisted? And then on top of that, are they close to 6 months? And then the last one, this is the one that really gets parents, is the baby showing a marked increase in interest in food? Okay, now, what does that mean? All right, if you have a baby around 6 months, they kind of start staring you down every time you bring food to them, right? They're going to start reaching for maybe what you're eating. They're going to be trying to grabbing what you're eating. If you eat right in front of them, they might start mimicking the eating habit. So like they're going to be smacking their lips and it'll look like they're almost trying to chew, okay? That's a pretty good sign that they're ready to start eating. Now, some feeding therapists and experts say, oh, it's when they start putting things in their mouth, but having a lot of babies, I know babies put everything in their mouth, so that's not necessarily a tried and true sign that your baby is ready to eat. So if you kind of put those things together, okay, then you can see the combination there is what's going to show us, is our baby ready to start foods, okay? Now, I got a couple of questions, and I want to make sure I get to those as well because there's a lot of really great questions about readiness to eat. So go ahead, if you have questions, let me know what they are. But I got a question from one of my students, and her name is Erin, and she was asking about the timing. Because you're like, I know you're talking about scheduling, but are you going to be talking about timing? When do you start solid foods, okay? When the baby starts eating, do they eat 3 meals a day? Don't stress yourself out, you guys. Start slow, but don't stay there forever. So my recommendation usually to parents is at about 6 months, try feeding, just start with 1 time a day. Do that for a couple days. They're not going to eat very much, okay? And then move it 1 to 2 times a day, okay? And then very quickly, within the next month or 2, you can start transition and that baby's going to, quote unquote, eat 3 times a day. Okay, but I want you to know that even an experienced 6-month-old baby, okay, may eat only 3 to 4 tablespoons of food at a time. Okay, and then even a smaller percentage of that might actually make it, past their mouth, their bib, their face, etc., into their stomach. So the key here is don't stress out about the quantity of food that they're eating. I got another email question from a fellow dietitian actually, and her name is Sally, and she was asking about her baby not actually ingesting it. And she was worried about nutrition and iron, and we're going to get all into that in some of the future Facebook Lives. Today we're just talking about timing as far as number of times. Try 2 times a day if you get going. A month or 2 into it, go up to 3. By the time your baby's 1, our goal is that they're going to be eating pretty much the same table foods that the rest of the family is. Although many babies will get there, closer to 9 or 10 months. Okay. I have a question from Nora. She has a daughter who's almost 2 years old and hasn't started solid food yet. And I was talking back and forth with her by email that this baby actually as a toddler, has only 5 foods in her repertoire. At 2, still not able to tolerate or hasn't been able to tolerate solid foods. A situation like that is definitely not in the usual realm of things that you would see outside of the feeding difficulty world. So my encouragement to a baby that's 2 and only has 5 foods and can't handle anything beyond purees, that you definitely want to work with a qualified speech language pathologist who specializes in infant feeding. And I'm super excited because I'm going to be having a colleague who is an infant feeding expert on Facebook Live with me as well. In the next couple of weeks, I'm bringing a bunch of different guests on to answer all of your questions about things like gagging and choking and what foods to feed and do I need to buy baby food, and then also how do I incorporate purees if I'm doing a baby-led approach to feeding, which I definitely endorse a combination of both purees and solid foods, and we'll talk about how you do that and in what sequence. So I have another question here, and it's from Jane saying that she has a baby who's 7 months old who's still not sleeping through the night, okay, which is very normal. And she's curious because she'd heard from friends that starting your baby on solid food could help the baby sleep through the night. So she had asked her pediatrician, who said, yeah, at 4 months if you want to start to help the baby sleep through the night. And it's unfortunate that some doctors are still giving that information. It's kind of an old wives' tale, but there's really no data to support or suggest that solid foods help the baby sleep through the night. I remember with one of my quadruplets who wasn't sleeping, my doctor's like, yeah, put some rice cereal in the bottle. But the amount of rice cereal that they were recommending was like less than a teaspoon, okay? Even though the baby's stomach is still very, very small, like what was that actually going to do? So I think in theory, sometimes it sounds like solid food might actually help your baby sleep through the night, but that's definitely not a reason to start solid foods. And no matter how fussy your baby is, maybe something different is certainly going on, but it's unlikely that they're hungry, and that's why they're not sleeping through the night. And if they are hungry and do need a feeding, remember, if they're less than 6 months old, breast milk or infant formula still should be the majority of the nutrition that that baby receives. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and just say thank you guys so much for joining me. I'm going to be on Facebook Live every Thursday at 12 noon Pacific time, answering all of your questions about infant feeding and bringing a lot of guests on too, who I hope will be able to shed light on some of the areas outside of nutrition, but still related to feeding that a lot of us have questions about. So thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you guys later.